Hello and welcome. Today we are going to discuss the history of the United States of America, more specifically, nonviolent protests in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, which includes protests both nonviolent and violent in hopes of ending segregation and discrimination against African Americans, the separate but equal time period. There were many figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and others who led the movement by organizing protests like the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. presented his influential speech, I Have a Dream. During this time period, there were three main types of nonviolent protests: sit-ins, boycotts, and marches. What was the most effective form of nonviolent protest during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s? There are three key factors that determine whether the nonviolent movement protest was successful.
The first factor is reaction, whether it be from the government or the citizens of the nation. Regarding the sit-ins, we will answer this question using the ones that took place in Greensboro in 1960. These consisted of black students asking for service in a white restaurant and not leaving until they received it. The main response was that people harassed them. However, no one was arrested, except for 41 students that were charged with trespassing, but that was unrelated to the cause of the sit-ins. On the other hand, in the case for boycotts, we will be answering this question using the Seattle school boycott that occurred in 1966 and the Montgomery bus boycott that took place in 1955. The Seattle school boycott of 1966 consisted in students missing class to protest a school segregation they believed was racially discriminatory. No one was arrested and no one was injured nor declared dead. Additionally, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 started with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a bus. Later, she was arrested for this action. Many, inspired by her example, began not giving up their seats for white men and women on buses. However, the majority stopped riding the bus at all and just walked everywhere they went as a protest toward the separate but equal lifestyle of Montgomery. For marches, we will be answering the question using the Walk on Selma, Bloody Sunday, and the March on Washington. The Walk on Selma of 1965 consisted of people marching for black voting rights. Although the march began as a peaceful affair, as the amount of people grew, so did the violent response, giving the day March 7th of 1965 the name Bloody Sunday. The march itself created a national outrage because the people marching were being beaten, threatened, and arrested. Citizens were horrified that the government was allowing such brutality to take place. The March on Washington of 1963 was one that caused a great response in the nation. However, it was not in a violent way since there were no arrests, beatings, or threats like in the Walk on Selma. However, there were oppositions to the whole event, mainly by the KKK, a pro-white supremacy organization. The president at first was not in favor of it either, but when he realized how many people were involved in supporting it, he started doing so too. Looking at this, we can assume that the events that caused the biggest reaction were the marches, since Bloody Sunday created the biggest commotion and responses from the USA, the government, and the policemen. Also, the March on Washington had a president at first opposed to it, but began supporting after many people participated in the event, which shows that the positive response from the people in the March on Washington could truly affect the mindset of the USA. This is the actual video footage of what had happened on March 7 during the Walk on Selma that was later named as Bloody Sunday. This footage is shocking, as the people are followed and hit by the police, increasing the acknowledgement of police brutality against black people. Additionally, it represents how black people really wanted to abolish the idea of separate but equal and be able to live all together without having to be discriminated and segregated through the color of their skin.
Another factor that determines the success of a nonviolent protest is the laws or advancements that can be achieved by it. Firstly, in the case of the Greensboro sit-ins of 1960, there weren't any laws created. However, it did create the SNCC. In the Seattle school boycott of 1966, the school boards ignored the request of the student protests and continued to maintain their racist and unequal way of managing the schools. This meaning that their attempts at bridging the gap were refused by the school board.
The Montgomery bus boycott resulted in a Supreme Court ruling that said that segregation in buses would be unconstitutional.
During the Walk on Selma, quote, President Johnson had submitted a voting rights legislation to Congress, and on August 6, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, end of quote, according to the King Institute Encyclopedia. Similarly, during the March on Washington, the 24th Amendment was ratified and abolished the poll tax, and the civil rights legislation was signed. Therefore, by looking at these categories, the marches created the most laws and largest impact. These marches created a stepping stone towards reaching equality and ending segregation. The images shown represent newspapers reporting that the Civil Rights Bill has been signed by the president after years of protests. These news are written in large letters, meaning that it is an important issue. However, it might have caused a lot of controversy between the white people since they have always lived with the idea of a separate but equal society.
The last factor is the involvement of the people, meaning if more people join to bridge the gap between blacks and whites. For the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, 20 students joined the cause. Later, 60 more joined all over Tennessee, Nashville, Atlanta, and Virginia. The Seattle school boycott of 1960 consisted of 3,000 students overall and 1,000 Asian American students. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 was the main cause for the Montgomery Improvement Association, which organized. For the walk on Selma on March 7th, there were 600 people marching. And on March 21st, there were 3,200 people marching. Then on March 25th, there were 25,000 people marching. For the March on Washington, there were 250,000 people, and a quarter of them were white. From this information, we can conclude that the March on Washington was the most successful one with 250,000 people. As we can see from the pictures, a lot of people went to advocate for their rights to these marches. Fair employment, voting rights for all were some of the causes that they fought for.
Marches were the ones that were most successful overall for this specific movement. In the case of the civil rights movement, people decided to use nonviolent protesting as a way to advocate for black rights and end segregation and racism. However, marches might not be the best way to do nonviolent protest for all the protests around the world. There are other factors. For example, the different organization, impactful human beings and their actions, the attribute to the advancement and eventual success of any movement that has existed or will exist in the world.
The rest of the world might not even want to use nonviolent protest to stand up to unfair things.